something extraordinary just happened in Tehran that Washington didn't see coming. The Supreme Leader has drawn a line in the sand, and it's forcing us to confront an uncomfortable truth about America's place in this new world order. You see, when Donald Trump extended what many called a historic peace offer to Iran, the conventional wisdom said Tehran would have no choice but to negotiate. After all, we're talking about the world's most powerful military and economy, right? But here's what the mainstream narrative won't tell you. Iran's rejection isn't about defiance for defiance's sake. It's about something far more profound. We're witnessing the death throes of American unipolar hegemony, and the Supreme Leader knows it. The BRICS expansion, the de-dollarization wave sweeping across Asia and the Middle East, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization gaining real teeth, these aren't just geopolitical footnotes. They're the foundation of Iran's confidence. Tehran is betting that the era of might makes right is ending, and they're willing to stake their future on a multipolar world where sovereignty actually means something. This decision will reshape the entire Middle Eastern chessboard. Let me take you back to a moment that most Americans have already forgotten, but one that Tehran remembers with crystal clarity. It was January 2020 when the United States assassinated General Qasem Soleimani in a drone strike at Baghdad International Airport. Now, I'm not here to romanticize the man or his record, but what matters is what he represented to Iran and to millions across the region. He wasn't just a military commander, he was the architect of Iran's regional influence, the man who had built networks from Lebanon to Yemen, from Syria to Iraq. And the United States eliminated him with the push of a button, as casually as ordering a pizza. The message was clear. American power could reach anywhere, anytime, and end anyone's life without consequence. Tehran absorbed that lesson, but not in the way Washington intended. Instead of cowering, instead of capitulating, Iran began a long-term strategic recalibration that we're only now beginning to understand. You have to appreciate the patience involved here. This isn't the kind of reactive, emotional decision-making that characterizes so much of Western foreign policy these days. The Iranians have been playing the long game for decades, and they've gotten very good at it. When Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal back in 2018, it was supposed to bring Tehran to its knees. Maximum pressure, they called it. Sanctions that would cripple the Iranian economy, isolate the country diplomatically, and force the regime to either collapse or come crawling back to the negotiating table on America's terms. But here's what the architects of that policy fundamentally misunderstood. They were operating from a playbook written in the 1990s, maybe even the 1980s, when American economic leverage was essentially absolute. Cut a country off from the dollar system, and you could starve it into submission. Except the world has changed in ways that Washington's foreign policy establishment hasn't fully grasped yet. Let's talk about what's really happening beneath the surface of this rejection. When the Supreme Leader says no to Trump's peace offer, he's not just saying no to this particular deal or this particular president. He's rejecting the entire framework of American dominance that has defined global politics since the end of the Cold War. Think about what that framework looks like from Tehran's perspective. It's a system where one country gets to unilaterally impose sanctions, freeze assets, blockade financial transactions, and dictate terms to sovereign nations. It's a system where international law applies to everyone except the hegemon. It's a system where the United States can invade Iraq on false pretenses, overthrow the Libyan government, arm insurgents in Syria, and then lecture other countries about respecting sovereignty and international norms. The sheer audacity of it would be laughable if it weren't so dangerous. But Iran has been watching the tectonic plates shift. They've seen Russia survive sanctions that were supposed to turn it into a pariah state. They've watched as Moscow not only survived but actually strengthened its economy by pivoting east, by building alternative payment systems, by deepening integration with China and India and the broader Asian market. They've observed how quickly the Russian economy adapted when cut off from SWIFT, how alternative financial architectures emerged almost overnight. This wasn't supposed to be possible according to the Washington consensus. The dollar was supposed to be irreplaceable, American financial infrastructure was supposed to be indispensable, and yet here we are watching a completely different reality unfold. And then there's China. Beijing has been absolutely meticulous in building the infrastructure for a post-American global order. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about building ports and railways, though it's certainly about that too. It's about creating economic dependencies that run in a completely different direction than the traditional Western-dominated trade routes. It's about denominating trade in yuan instead of dollars. It's about establishing development banks that operate outside the IMF and World Bank framework. China has essentially been constructing a parallel financial and economic universe, and they've been doing it so gradually, so methodically, that most Americans haven't even noticed. But Iran has noticed. Iran has been taking notes. The Supreme Leader's rejection of Trump's offer has to be understood in this context. Tehran is betting, and I think it's a rational bet, that they can afford to wait out American pressure because the global balance of power is shifting in their favor. Every month that passes, every new bilateral trade agreement signed in local currencies, every new pipeline that connects Asian markets, every new port that opens along the Belt and Road, all of this represents a diminishment of American leverage. And Iran has proven, if nothing else, that it can endure. 45 years of sanctions, 45 years of international isolation, 45 years of being told they're on the verge of collapse, and yet the Islamic Republic endures. That's not an endorsement of the regime, let me be clear, but it is a recognition of reality. Now let's talk about what Trump's offer likely contained, based on what we know about his approach to foreign policy. Trump operates from a business mindset, which means he thinks in terms of deals and leverage. The offer probably included some sanctions relief, maybe some pathway to normalized relations, possibly even security guarantees. But it almost certainly came with conditions that would require Iran to fundamentally alter its regional posture. Give up your missile program, stop supporting Hezbollah, withdraw from Syria, cut ties with the Houthis in Yemen, end your nuclear ambitions forever, and in exchange, you get to rejoin the community of nations on terms that Washington finds acceptable. From an American perspective, this might seem reasonable. From Tehran's perspective, it's a demand for unconditional surrender, dressed up as diplomacy. Here's the thing that American policymakers consistently fail to understand. Iran's regional influence isn't just about ideology or religion or some irrational hatred of the West. It's about basic security calculus. Iran is surrounded by American military bases. Look at a map sometime. Really study it. Afghanistan had American troops for 20 years. Iraq has American bases. The Persian Gulf is patrolled by the American Fifth Fleet. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of them host American military assets. Turkey is a NATO member. Israel has the most advanced American weapons systems. From Tehran's perspective, they're encircled by a hostile military alliance that has explicitly called for regime change. Under those circumstances, developing asymmetric capabilities isn't aggression, it's survival. The proxy networks that Iran has built across the Middle East serve a very specific strategic purpose. They create what military strategists call strategic depth. If the United States or Israel or Saudi Arabia decides to attack Iran, Tehran has the ability to strike back across multiple theaters. Hezbollah in Lebanon can threaten northern Israel. Shia militias in Iraq can target American forces and installations. The Houthis in Yemen can disrupt shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Syrian government forces, backed by Iran, control strategic territory. This isn't a bug in Iran's strategic thinking. It's the central feature. And you're asking them to give all of that up in exchange for promises from a country that has repeatedly demonstrated it considers itself bound by agreements only as long as they're convenient. Remember, Iran did make a deal with the international community. The JCPOA wasn't just an American agreement, it was negotiated with the UK, France, Germany, Russia, and China. The International Atomic Energy Agency verified repeatedly that Iran was in compliance with its obligations. Iranian reformists and moderates staked their political credibility on the idea that engaging with the West could work. And then Donald Trump, in his first term, simply walked away from it, reinstated sanctions, declared the deal the worst agreement ever negotiated. And the Europeans, despite their protests and their stated commitment to the agreement, ultimately proved unable or unwilling to stand up to American secondary sanctions. If you're sitting in Tehran, what lesson do you draw from that experience? You draw the lesson that American promises are worthless, that international agreements mean nothing if Washington changes its mind, and that the only security comes from the capabilities you control yourself. So when Trump comes back now with a new offer, with new promises, with new guarantees, why on earth would Tehran trust it? Even if Trump personally intends to honor whatever deal he's proposing, what happens when the next administration comes in? What happens when the political winds shift in Washington, when the next crisis erupts, when the Israel lobby or the Saudi lobby or the defense contractors decide that the deal isn't in their interest anymore? Iran would be asked to give up tangible strategic assets in exchange for intangible promises that experience has taught them are unreliable at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. But there's another dimension to this that we need to explore, and it has to do with what's happening inside Iran itself. The regime has survived for 45 years, in part because it has successfully framed itself as the defender of Iranian sovereignty against foreign domination. This narrative goes back long before 1979. It goes back to the 1953 coup when the CIA and British intelligence overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh because he had the audacity to nationalize Iran's oil industry. It goes back to the decades of the Shah's rule, when Iran was essentially a client state of the United States, when American advisors filled the government ministries, when the country's resources were exploited for the benefit of Western corporations. The Islamic Revolution, whatever else you want to say about it, was fundamentally about rejecting that subordinate status. For the supreme leader to accept a deal that looks like capitulation to American demands would undermine the entire legitimacy structure of the regime. It would vindicate the critics who say that resistance is futile, that Iran should have accommodated Western demands decades ago, that all the sacrifice and suffering has been for nothing. It would embolden internal opposition movements that argue for a fundamentally different relationship with the West. And while there are certainly Iranians who would welcome such a shift, the power structure that currently controls the country views it as an existential threat. They're not wrong about that, by the way. A genuine opening to the West probably would lead to demands for internal reform, for democratization, for an end to clerical rule. The regime's survival depends on maintaining the framework of resistance. Now, I want to be clear about something because I know how these discussions can be misinterpreted. Analyzing Iran's strategic logic doesn't mean endorsing the Iranian regime. The Islamic Republic has a deeply problematic human rights record. It suppresses dissent, it restricts freedoms, it has executed thousands of political prisoners over the decades. Iranian women are forced to live under oppressive restrictions. Religious minorities face persecution. These are serious moral issues that deserve condemnation. But if we're trying to understand why the supreme leader is rejecting Trump's offer, we need to set aside moral judgments for a moment and think strategically. We need to understand the calculus as Tehran sees it, not as we wish they would see it. And from that strategic perspective, the rejection makes perfect sense. Iran has managed to survive and even expand its influence despite decades of maximum pressure. Its economy has found ways to adapt through black market oil sales, through cryptocurrency, through barter arrangements, through trade relationships with countries that are willing to ignore American sanctions. Is it ideal? Of course not. Has it imposed real costs on the Iranian people? Absolutely. But the regime has survived, and in their calculation, time is on their side. Every year that passes, America's relative power declines a little bit more. Not because America is necessarily getting weaker in absolute terms, but because the rest of the world is rising. China's economy continues to grow. India is becoming a major power. The global south is finding its voice and rejecting the old colonial hierarchies. The dollar's dominance is eroding slowly but unmistakably. Think about what just happened with Saudi Arabia. For decades, the foundation of American financial hegemony has been the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states would sell oil exclusively in dollars, and those dollars would be recycled into American treasury bonds and financial markets. This arrangement gave the United States enormous structural power over the global economy. But Saudi Arabia has now announced it's willing to accept payment in yuan, in euros, in other currencies. The exclusive dollar arrangement is over. That's a watershed moment that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention in American media. If Saudi Arabia, America's oldest and most important ally in the Middle East, is hedging its bets and diversifying away from dollar dependence, what does that tell you about where they think the world is heading? Iran sees all of this. They see the Saudis making their own calculations about a post-American Middle East. They see the UAE establishing itself as a neutral trading hub that does business with everyone. They see Turkey playing both sides, remaining in NATO while buying Russian weapons and expanding economic ties with China. They see Iraq trying to balance between Iranian influence and American pressure. The entire regional order is in flux, and the old certainties are disappearing. In that environment, locking yourself into a deal that requires you to disarm while your adversaries remain heavily armed seems like strategic suicide. Let's also talk about the nuclear dimension, because that's obviously central to any negotiation between Washington and Tehran. The American position has always been that Iran must never be allowed to develop nuclear weapons. Fair enough, nobody wants nuclear proliferation. But from Iran's perspective, they're surrounded by nuclear powers, or nuclear-capable states. Israel has an estimated 200 nuclear warheads, though it maintains a policy of strategic ambiguity and refuses to confirm or deny. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, and the United States, which maintains the largest nuclear arsenal in the world, has troops and bases throughout the region. So Iran is being told that it must forego even the capability to develop nuclear weapons while facing potential adversaries who already possess them. Does that seem like a reasonable security arrangement from Tehran's point of view? Now, you might argue that Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and therefore has obligations under international law. That's true. But Israel never signed the NPT, and the United States has never pressured them to do so. In fact, the United States provides Israel with billions of dollars in military aid every year, while maintaining a studied silence about its nuclear program. The double standard is obvious to everyone in the region, even if American politicians prefer not to acknowledge it. Iran's argument has always been that they're entitled to civilian nuclear technology under the NPT, including uranium enrichment for peaceful purposes, and that they've never made a strategic decision to pursue weapons. Whether you believe that claim or not, it's worth noting that American intelligence agencies have consistently assessed that Iran is not currently pursuing a nuclear weapon, even if they're developing capabilities that could be used for that purpose in the future. The supreme leader has actually issued a fatwa, a religious ruling, declaring that nuclear weapons are forbidden under Islamic law. Now, you might be skeptical of that, and perhaps you should be. Religious rulings can be reversed or reinterpreted when circumstances change, but it does represent a public commitment that would be difficult to walk back without significant internal political costs. The point is that Iran has maintained that its nuclear program is purely civilian for energy and medical research, and that it has no intention of building weapons. The problem is that the technology required for civilian nuclear power is very similar to the technology required for weapons, which creates what strategists call a threshold capability. Iran could potentially break out and build a weapon relatively quickly if it decided to do so, even if it's not doing so currently. This is where the JCPOA was actually quite clever. It didn't require Iran to abandon nuclear technology entirely, which would have been politically impossible for any Iranian government to accept. Instead, it imposed strict limitations and intrusive inspections that would make it very difficult for Iran to break out without detection, and it extended the timeline such that any breakout attempt would take at least a year, giving the international community time to respond. In exchange, Iran got sanctions relief and a pathway back to normal economic relations. It wasn't a perfect deal, no deal ever is, but it represented a workable compromise that balanced competing interests. And it was working, by all objective measures, until Trump withdrew from it.